Well, I would say, first of all, we have to remember that this whole crisis was created and catalyzed by Russian political, economic, and military pressure on Ukraine, on the Ukrainian government, to turn course away from the European Union. That's what happened over the course of the summer, and it catalyzed in the fall and the winter, in November specifically, into the eruptions we saw of public protest against that turn, against that pressure. And second, I think it's very clear that the Russians are considering different options for Ukraine. The Russian press is full of assessments about how Ukraine can be partitioned. You've had senior Putin advisors traveling through Ukraine, to Kiev, to Crimea, talking about the need for federalism, the need for regions within Ukraine to have its own foreign policy, even a partition. And it's not surprising that after one of his advisors visits to Crimea, there's been talk about Crimean secession. So this is a contingency that we have to closely monitor. And I think one shortcoming of the West's approach to this crisis has been to kind of almost ignore the Russian role in the tragedy that we see in the Maidan. I mean, we're spending a lot of time sanctioning Ukrainian officials, but we've done nothing to respond to the Russian political, economic, and military pressure that's the root of this crisis. I mean, Russia used trade sanctions, used energy leverage to pressure the Ukrainians, yet have we raised in the WTO these Russian actions? This is a dimension that we can't pretend doesn't exist, because pretending that it doesn't exist won't make it go away. And pretending it actually ties our hand and also makes it more difficult for us to give the Ukrainians confidence that we're going to stand with them. So this has to become a more prominent element of our strategy to help Ukraine choose its own way. Well, I think we have to first start making clear that as long as Russia is acting the way it is toward Ukraine, we can't have business as usual. So I commend the EU's decision not to give Russian VIPs visa-free travel in the EU. That was a useful step. I think we ought to really slow down Russia's application to the OECD. I was surprised that the U.S. administration was hosting the deputy Russian prime minister and talking about moving into a new trade agreement or investment agreement with the Russians at the very time in December when the Russians were squeezing the Ukrainians economically. A week later, the Minister of Energy from Russia was in Washington signing an energy cooperation agreement. At the same time, the Russian government was squeezing the Ukrainians through its leverage on gas and oil supplies to Ukraine. These sort of agreements ought to be ratcheted back, and the United States and the EU ought to make clear that progress in them won't happen as long as Russia is using economic and political leverage against Ukraine. Another consideration is to condition U.S. participation, European participation in the G8 meeting in Sochi. It's not clear to me why we ought to be giving Russia, and particularly President Putin, legitimacy in an economic and democratic forum like the G8 at a time when it's using economic and political coercion to prevent the Ukrainian people from choosing the direction they want to take. So these are some steps that I think are necessary and needed to communicate to Russia that we're taking this seriously. And it also conditions Russian participation and role in these organizations according to the very principles upon which these organizations are founded. Free trade, respect for the sovereignty of other countries, respect for democracy.